The Hamilton Wentworth District School Board acknowledges our presence on ancestral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee Confederacy land determined by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. The Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt represents the treaty relationships between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe with respect to sharing the land and resources thereon. The intent of this agreement is for all nations sharing this territory to do so responsibly, respectfully, and sustainably in perpetuity. We respect the long-standing relationships with the local Indigenous communities, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, and the Six Nations of the Grand River.
Hello, Renegades. R.A. Riddell. Today, we wear orange to ally and stand in solidarity with the Indigenous people of Canada. As we have learned in history, it symbolizes the 1970s as we honor the story of Phyllis Webstad, who in the early 1970s had her orange shirt taken away on her very first day at a residential school. We as settlers in this land and as Canadians, we identify with the sovereign-seeking peoples, the Indigenous people, who have used the orange shirt as a symbol of resistance and survival. As Canadians, we act in solidarity and as allies and are proud to be, in solidarity with the Indigenous people. I am proud to be in solidarity with Indigenous people. How about you?
Good morning, Aria Riddell. My name is Bella, and today I will be explaining to you why this is an important day for Canadians. Today is a day where we discuss and reflect upon the horrible legacy residential schools that had impacted our neighbors of the First Nations.
Each of our classrooms will reflect on this day in their own unique ways. That being said, remember to visit the front foyer display case, which displays symbols and words of National Reconciliation Day, which emphasizes on themes and healings of reflection.
Today is the day of remembrance, reflection, action, and learning since 2013. September 30th is known as Orange Shirt Day, born out of Phyllis Webstad's personal experience of residential schools. You will now listen to her experience through the residential school system.
Wade Huhuadap, Phyllis Webstad Rensquest, Stracham Chatstam Slagwin. I am speaking to you today from Shawetmach Ulach, the land of the Shuswap people in Williams Lake, BC. I am third generation Indian residential school survivor. My grandmother attended for 10 years from 1925 to 1935. All of Granny's 10 children, including my mother, attended for 10 years from 1954 to 1964. I attended residential school in 1973-74. We all attended the St. Joseph Mission Indian Residential School, simply called the Mission, located just minutes from Williams Lake. My son also attended the last operating residential school in Canada when it closed in Saskatchewan in 1996. To tell my story, I was living with my granny as a child, and when I turned 6 in July of 1973, Granny took me to town to buy me something new to wear for my first day of residential school. I chose a shiny new shirt. It was bright and exciting, just how I felt to be going to school for the first time. When I arrived at the Mission, my shiny new shirt was taken away. No matter how much I cried and wanted it back, no one would listen. I never wore my shirt again. Thoughts of home and Granny's garden, fishing for salmon on the Fraser River, are all memories that helped me through that year at residential school. Although the Mission remained open until 1981, I never returned. I was able to attend a one-room schoolhouse just minutes from Granny's house in Dog Creek. The memories of that orange shirt being taken away and the lack of caring by those who controlled us kept me from wearing orange for a long time in my life, as the sight of orange would trigger memories of my experiences and the effects of my life from attendance at that school. I told my orange shirt story for the first time in April 2013, when preparation for when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came to Williams Lake. Those involved with the event decided to honor the orange shirt as a symbol of the effects of residential schools and the need for every child matters. Originally, Orange Shirt Day was focused on the Caribou-Chilcotin region, but thanks to social media, it continues to grow and have a life of its own and has grown into what it is today. My orange shirt story is not unique. There were 150,000 children that attended the residential schools across Canada, and they, or their families, all have a story to tell of that experience. And now, with the recent news of the confirmation of the 215 children announced at the Kamloops de Shawetmach on May 27, 2021, another experience from those schools is brought forward. I, like many Canadians, have felt the emotional impact of those findings. But for the survivors, we have always known about the children who died in those schools. This is why I say confirmation instead of discovery. Even so, when I first heard, I felt like I had lost a family member, and that's how much grief I felt. There are many more residential school sites to be searched, and the number of missing children and unmarked burials will continue to rise. I'm still grappling for a way to make sense of it all and wondering how we are going to get through this. My thoughts and prayers go out to the families, to everyone across Canada experiencing this unimaginable emotional pain. The missing children have awakened all of us to the reality of the history of this country. This year marks the first year of a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation and National Federal Statutory Holiday on September 30th. A day for thoughts and discussions on remembering, recovering, and reconciling. Orange Shirt Day is a day to have conversation about all aspects of residential school. It is a day to honor residential school survivors and their families, and to remember those that didn't make it. And a day to highlight progress in the reconciliation of Indigenous people and Canadian society. These actions are necessary to bring about healing for the future relationship in Canada. We chose September 30th because September is the time of year the children were taken away from their homes and their families. We chose the 30th because we wanted teachers and students time to settle in, time for teachers to teach students about the history, and time for us to plan an event. When I heard an elder say that September was Crying Month, I knew that we had selected the right date. The Orange Shirt Society has produced a number of videos available on our website for the purpose of teaching the past history and bringing understanding of the Canadian residential school system and its effects on Indigenous peoples. We encourage all to learn more of this subject. In closing, I want to thank everyone for participating in Orange Shirt Day and wearing an orange shirt. When you wear an orange shirt, it's like a little bit of justice for us survivors in our lifetime, and recognition of a system we can never allow again.
September 30th is Orange Shirt Day. Please wear orange to help remember people who went to residential schools.
Before residential schools, learning was part of life for children, and their grandparents were their teachers. They harvested resources from the land and were very thankful for them.
Skills were passed down from generation to generation.
The Indian residential school often took children away at a young age. They usually kept the children for 10 months of the year.
If their parents said no for their children to go to residential schools, then they might be arrested.
The government thought that the children should be Christian because they thought God wanted it.
Children were taken out of their homes for 10 months at a time before they could see their parents again.
Children were often forced to be taken away from home, or their parents might go to jail.
Residential schools got the kids to do their work and stuff that is not good for children.
If the parents said no, then they could go to jail.
When children went to residential schools, the nuns often did not love or care about the kids and didn't treat them with respect. They got their name taken away and they were called by numbers. They also cut their hair and didn't feed them very well.
Phyllis was poor and did not get new clothes often. Before she went to her school, grandmother bought her a new orange shirt.
At the Indian residential schools, they took away their clothes from the children, and Phyllis never saw her orange shirt again. She cried, but no one cared.
Her mom and grandma went to the Indian residential school for 10 years. Phyllis also went to a healing center and wrote 2 books.
I think everyone should know that some children were starved and abused.
I think that everyone should know that some students had their names changed.
The schools were open for 104 years. That's like your dad's dad's dad. That's a long time ago.
September 30th is Orange Shirt Day. Please wear orange to help remember people who went to residential schools.
Kids News explains. What is reconciliation? Let's Google the word reconciliation. Here's what comes up. To reconcile or restore friendly relations. Kind of like when you get into an argument with a friend and they hurt you, but then you make up. In recent years, reconciliation has taken on a new and important role in Canada. Maybe you've heard of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, or the new federal holiday known as the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. But what does it all actually mean? And why do we need reconciliation? Part of reconciliation is recognizing that non-Indigenous people have harmed Indigenous people in Canada for centuries and treated them differently than white people. For some people, reconciliation is the opportunity to heal a broken relationship and to establish a Canada that honors Indigenous people and their contributions. So, where does reconciliation stand now? The current process of reconciliation is often tied to 2 different groups. Number 1, government.
Mr. Speaker, I stand before you today to offer an apology to former students of Indian residential schools. The treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history.
That was former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. He made a historic apology in the House of Commons in 2008. So that part of the process of reconciliation is about the government acknowledging something wrong and taking the steps to make it right. But many Indigenous people and their allies say an apology without action isn't enough. Like, if you say sorry to a friend for hurting them without changing your behavior, is it really an apology? Number 2, individuals. The second part of reconciliation is more about individual action. Attempts at reconciliation are happening all around us. Individuals and groups are trying to highlight the past and present unfair treatment of Indigenous people in Canada. Think of it as learning from the past and trying to do better. For example, reading about residential schools. So, when did Canada's reconciliation with Indigenous peoples begin? The process of reconciliation was made official in Canada in 2008. That was when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was launched as a way to record the effects of residential schools on Indigenous peoples. More than 6 years of work was done by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, also known as the TRC. The chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Senator Murray Sinclair, said,
"Reconciliation is about atonement, it's about making amends, it's about apology, it's about recognizing responsibility."
3 commissioners traveled across the country listening to more than 6,500 witnesses and their families about the negative impacts of residential schools and other mistreatments. The result of all that work was a report that listed 94 recommendations, or calls to action, to help repair the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities and prevent future and ongoing harm. The calls to action are separated into sections like language, health, sport, education, and media. Some examples of a call to action would be number 7. We call on Canada to work with Indigenous people to make sure that all kids in Canada are getting a fair education and chances for a job. And number 20. We call on Canada to respect the health needs of all Indigenous people, no matter where they live in Canada. Although the federal government has acknowledged the results of the Truth and Reconciliation Report, many of these calls to action have not been addressed. What do we do now? Reconciliation is a long and hard process of making wrongs right. Although not everyone will agree on the exact way of making things better, here are some ways you can make a difference. Number 1, paying attention in history class when your teacher is talking about Canada's treatment of Indigenous peoples. Number 2, remembering and honoring residential school survivors and their families on Orange Shirt Day and beyond. Number 3, reading about Indigenous issues. Number 4, reading all 94 calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Report. Number 5, speaking up when you see Indigenous peoples being treated unfairly or you hear racist remarks. This has been KN Explains Reconciliation. For CBC Kids News, I'm Isabel DeRoy Olsen. Chimigwech, bye!
The residential school system was created to remove and isolate Indigenous children from their communities and force them to assimilate into the dominant culture.
But like the northern lights that dance through the big cold sky, our sacred stories can never be taken. The trees teach us that the path of healing can take time, but during the hurt and brokenness, Creator is with us. The soothing heartbeat of the drum gathers our people from all corners of Turtle Island as we stand with quiet strength. Like the brave eagle, our voices are rising with pride as we embrace our sacred identity. I am Inuk. Residential schools try to erase our language, traditions, and our identity. But we stand as a generation committed to reclaiming our strong, beautiful, resilient heritage. I will wear an orange shirt for the ones before me who were taken from their communities, their traditions, and their culture. I will wear an orange shirt for the coming generations that will emerge as warriors.